and welcome history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges and we're back again to take another look at Rome. In this episode, I'll be covering the real history that Season 2 is based on, as well as pointing out which parts that aren't. I'll also be giving my impressions on this series, my likes and dislikes with it, and sadly cover its lasting legacy. Despite how much of a hit Season 1 was, its exorbitant production costs were simply too high for HBO to bear, which is what led to its untimely cancellation. At the time, it was the most expensive television show ever made. That was until another HBO show would eventually take its place. It's a hard pill to swallow, but the lessons HBO learned from Rome is what helped make Game of Thrones possible. So when Bruno Heller, the creator of Rome, was told that there wouldn't be a third season, he was halfway through writing Season 2. This left him with no choice but to condense seasons worth of material into only 10 episodes. Because of this, a lot of history had to be cut out, so I'm going to try my best to fill in the blanks and give this show an imperial send-off. This is Rome. 15th of March, 44 BC. The Roman world has been turned upside down. Its ruler, Julius Caesar, lies murdered on the Senate floor. The news spreads quickly as people flee the streets and hide within their homes, fearful over what would come next. The Republic has endured 4 long years of conflict in Caesar's civil war. After only a year of peace, the threat of open revolution has returned. But led by whom was the big question. The conspirators believed that with Caesar's death, his regime would collapse and the old system of government would be restored once more. Calling themselves the Liberators, they were led by 2 influential senators, Cassius Longinus and Marcus Brutus. Cassius, the original instigator of the plot, resented Caesar for not advancing his political career. Knowing he wasn't the only one who wanted him dead, he was able to win over many senators. But they needed one with the right family name to lead. The older their name, the more noble their cause would be. Brutus, Cassius's brother-in-law, was the obvious choice. His family was of the Junii, and his ancestor was Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who overthrew Rome's last king and became its first consul.
Rome has fallen into the hands of a corrupt monster. You, direct descendant of the father of the Republic. What do you do?
What would you have me do?
Now, for dramatic purposes, it is Brutus's mother Servilia who convinces him to murder Caesar. She was, after all, Caesar's favourite mistress, and when he ends their affair in the show, she is enraged by the experience and wants him dead. However, some historians believe that it might have been Brutus's wife Porcia Catinus who persuaded him instead, but we don't see or hear any mention of her in the show. Another reason Brutus was picked for the job was his close friendship to Caesar. Despite having fought against him in the Civil War, Caesar forgave Brutus, and in his mind, they had made peace. At the doors of the Senate, Caesar's co-consul and most trusted general, Mark Antony, was blocked by the Liberators. By the time he forced his way in, there was nothing he could do. In fear for his life, Mark Antony fled the scene, anticipating that the Liberators would purge all of Caesar's supporters and take the city. But this move never came. In their naivety, the Liberators had gravely miscalculated the situation. They had no real plan over what to do next, and they underestimated Caesar's popularity with the common people. The only ones who really cheered for his death were the Liberators. In fact, they were so scared of the enraged masses that they barricaded themselves indoors. Upon learning this, Mark Antony re-evaluated his position and quickly figured out the Liberators had no clue what the hell they were doing. So on the 17th of March, he met with the conspirators to negotiate a compromise. In real life, this meeting took place in the Senate and not in Servilia's house.
Caesar is not declared tyrants, nor you declared killers. All Caesar's acts and his will shall stand. We shall all keep our posts. It will be as if you were struck by lightning. Then a show of unity. A public funeral for Caesar, led by you and I together. We shall mourn the man and burn the tyrant.
This meant that if the Liberators continued to push Caesar's murder as a lawful tyrannicide, it would nullify all of Caesar's populist reforms. This is because the laws and proposals of a tyrant are unlawful in Roman society. but it would also invalidate all those nice fancy titles Caesar gave to his fellow senators, including Brutus and Cassius. So very quickly, these self-righteous hypocrites agreed, and they were pardoned. A few days later, a confident Mark Antony called for Caesar's will reading. Knowing that he had been Caesar's right-hand man, that he was popular with the people, and that Caesar had no surviving children, Antony figured his chance of inheritance was good. But the will contained a surprise that nobody saw coming.
My name and the remainder of my estate, with all legal obligations and benefits, all property, gold, silver, and other monies, I leave to Gaius Octavian, who is henceforth to be regarded, for all intents and purposes, as my lawful son and sole heir.
Now, Octavian was Caesar's great-nephew, but at the time of the will reading, he wasn't in Rome. He was actually studying at a military academy in Illyricum, but as soon as he heard the news of Caesar's death, he rushed back to Rome to press his claim. And he needed to do it quickly, as not many people in the Roman hierarchy knew who this 19-year-old boy was. And there was a good reason for that. Unlike in HBO's Rome, his immediate family weren't patricians, aristocrats. They weren't members of the powerful ruling class families. Apart from Octavian, his sister Octavia and his mother Attia were plebeians. Although not in the same manner as Vorenus and Pullo, their extreme wealth placed them on the fringes of aristocratic society, but they were still below the nobility, and therefore weren't major players in the great game. And yet, almost out of nowhere, Octavian was chosen to be Caesar's heir. But why? Well, to the average Roman, Octavian didn't really strike much of an impression. As portrayed in the show, he was an intelligent, reserved, and quiet young man. He wasn't athletic or much of a fighter, so not really the valued traits of an ideal Roman.
There's plenty of soldier in you.
Oh, it's not the killing. It's the waving about of swords I find tedious. I dare say I can kill people readily enough, as long as they're not fighting back.
Never fear, young Dominus. We'll make a regular terror of you.
He was also prone to sporadic illnesses, and because of this, his mother Attia was overprotective, even more so than in the show. In fact, HBO's version of Attia's character constantly tries to groom Octavian into a true Roman, whereas the real Attia sheltered him. She constantly worried about his health and didn't want him to be a part of that life. As a young adult, she kept him under constant supervision, even making him sleep in the same nursery apartment he had as a baby.
I'm old enough to take care of myself.
Oh, that's my brave little man.
In a way, Octavian kinda reminds me of the Saxon king Alfred the Great, who was very similar, especially with how they compensated for their weaknesses by using their fierce intelligence. And Caesar was quick to spot Octavian's. Now, we don't know for certain when they first met. It might have been when Caesar returned from Egypt in 47 BC, or perhaps a little bit earlier. Regardless, Caesar was a quick judge of character and was impressed with Octavian's intellect, detecting great promise with the boy. After their brief interaction, Caesar officially enrolled Octavian as a patrician. He was 16 at the time. Later that year, Caesar sailed off to Africa to confront the Pompeian forces there. Octavian asked to join for military experience, but Caesar refused out of concern for his health, that the harsh African climate might be too much for him. They met a few more times, but arguably the most crucial was in 46 BC, when Caesar departed for his campaign in Spain to finish up the remaining Pompeian forces. On this occasion, he invited Octavian to join him, but Octavian was still suffering from an earlier illness, so instead he would follow Caesar when he fully recovered. When he was fit enough to travel, he set off, but was later caught in a storm at sea and was shipwrecked. By the time he and a small party had caught up to Caesar's army, the war had finally been won. Octavian missed his chance to gain battle experience, but what he got instead was far more important. For the next month or so, they stayed in Spain, and Octavian spent quality time with his great uncle. They ate together, they shared the same quarters, and had many conversations about politics, philosophy, and so on. Caesar clearly thought fondly of the boy, but there was a reason for this time spent together. According to Greek historian Nicholas of Damascus, he said, and I quote, "He made a point of engaging him in conversation, for he was anxious to make a trial of his understanding, and finding out that he was sagacious, intelligent, and concise in his replies, and that he always answered to the point. His esteem and affection of him increased." It is entirely possible that these few weeks in Spain may have been what ultimately convinced Caesar to secretly make Octavian his heir. So anyway, just to go back a bit, this posthumous adoption by Caesar challenged Mark Antony's leading role in the Caesarian movement. But unlike Octavian, who was relatively unknown, Mark Antony had the love of the people on his side, a fact he would take advantage of at Caesar's funeral on the 20th of March, 44 BC. As consul, his role was simply to deliver a eulogy, but it would go down as one of the most important speeches in history. So imagine my huge disappointment when they cut it out. We don't see Mark Antony make his famous speech, just this immediate aftermath with the crowd going mental, and then a few moments later it cuts to them talking about it. Vaguely, I might add.
Please, speak sense to your son. Him and his friends must leave the city. I cannot answer for their safety.
Do not look so pleased with yourself. You're a liar and a breaker of oaths, and you've roused a rabble. Nothing more.
If you're unfamiliar with Roman history, then you're not going to know what the hell just happened. If you are a history buff, then the exclusion of the funeral speech just frustrates you even more. According to Bruno Heller, the reasons for cutting it was due to budget constraints.
Brutus's speech and Mark Antony's speech would have all been a production nightmare, essentially. So explaining the funeral and what happened afterwards is, you know, it's clever, I suppose. I think it is. It works.
No, it doesn't. The explanation he's talking about involves this really lame scene when some drunkards go over what happened at the funeral.
Oi, right, the place is fucking packed, yeah? It takes me half an hour to fight my way to the front, and up steps Brutus. Right? And he goes, blah, blah, blah. The law this, and the republic that. Then Antony's up, but he gives Brutus a hug. Like, he starts talking all calm and gentle, like he's not bothered. But then he pulls out Caesar's toga, all covered in blood. But now Antony's stalking up and down with the toga. And he's crying about what a good man was Caesar, and how much he loves him, and what a great leader we've lost. He takes the bloody toga and throws it into the crowd. Whoosh! The whole fucking place went up like a tar barrel. The whole fucking crowd went mad. But Brutus and them are lucky to be alive.
I'm sorry to say this, but I don't like this scene. As an explanation, it's oversimplified and dumbed down. And also, what is it with HBO using Cockney geezers for exposition? Because somehow, they wound up doing a very similar thing in Game of Thrones. In fact, they might even be the same bloody character.
She looks my way, gives me a little smile like, well, it's all right, you know, I've never been shy and I'm blessed down south, so I put it right out.
But unlike Game of Thrones, we don't get that same satisfying character exit. So what really happened at that speech? Well, the general gist is that Antony manipulated the crowd's emotions as they grieved for Caesar. He read to them Caesar's will and went over the donations he left to the people. Then he picked up Caesar's bloodstained toga, presenting it to the crowd and working them up into a frenzy by vowing to avenge Caesar's killers, right in front of the faces of Brutus and Cassius. The mob grew angry and quickly a riot ensued. Mark Antony had successfully united the common people to his side, and fearing for their lives, Brutus and Cassius fled to Greece. So like I said, it's a very historic speech, and dare I say it's culturally significant, because even William Shakespeare recognized its dramatic potential and immortalized it in his play, Julius Caesar.
I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar.
The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it was so, it was a grievous fault. Grievously hath Caesar answered it.
Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honourable man, so are they all honourable men, come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honourable man.
Now, is it fair to use Shakespeare as an example? Maybe not, but the point I'm trying to make is that you don't need to shoot a big budget funeral procession to simply show Mark Antony's speech. You can make do with a few close-up shots of the crowd. All you really need is a great script and performance. But instead they went with this.
Blah, blah, blah. The law this and the Republic that.
So anyway, by the time Octavian returned to Rome, Mark Antony had consolidated his power as the new leader of the Caesarian movement. The conflict between these two first began when Octavian asked for his inheritance, which Mark Antony was in sole possession of.
A word, if I may.
What is it, dear boy?
About my money. Caesar's money. You assured me I'd have it by now.
I'm so sorry, it slipped my mind. I will see to it.
Good, only that is what you've said several times now.
These things take time, eh? We are talking vast sums of money.
Antony quickly grew irritated with Octavian's persistence and pointed out that Caesar's adoption was not yet official. He later made every effort he could to delay its confirmation, but Octavian would not take this lying down. Aside from not paying him, Antony had also neglected to pay Rome's people and veterans their promised share of Caesar's money. Seeing an opportunity, Octavian borrowed a ludicrous amount of money to fulfill these bequests, even going as far as to sell Caesar's private lands and estates to see it through. These actions spoke far louder than Antony's promises, and they threatened his leading role in the Caesarian faction. The fanatical devotion that Rome's people felt for Caesar was now transferred to Octavian, even winning the hearts and minds of many veterans. Legions who had served with Caesar were now flocking to his side. As the battle lines were being drawn, everyone watched and waited.
A fool like Antony was sure to blunder. They'll fight among themselves and they'll destroy each other.
I doubt the boy will be more than a nuisance to Antony. He cannot hope to rival him.
Caesar did not choose the boy on a whim. He'll surprise you, I think.
We can hope.
With the arrival of Octavian, a smear campaign had been launched against Antony. A notable politician called Cicero did the most damage by rallying much of the Senate against Antony with a series of speeches called the Philippics. They were designed to attack his character, his reputation, and to demonize him as a threat to Rome. With Antony's popularity slipping away and the end of his consulship drawing near, he made plans to protect himself. Unhappy with his assignment to govern Macedonia, he pushed the Senate for Cisalpine Gaul instead. The province was close enough to Rome that if he was ever threatened, he could swoop down to Italy with his army. But there was a problem. Cisalpine Gaul already had a governor, Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators in Caesar's assassination. The Senate refused to negotiate, leaving Antony little choice but to take his army and besiege the governor at Mutina. The fact that Decimus Brutus was one of Caesar's assassins also helped Antony's credibility with his troops. As soon as he set off, the Senate denounced Mark Antony, declaring him an enemy of Rome, and turned to Octavian for military support. Cicero in particular thought he could easily manipulate Octavian and discard him once he had served his purpose. On the 21st of April 43 BC, Octavian's forces subdued Antony's at the city of Mutina and lifted the siege. Although defeated, Mark Antony was able to escape with the remainder of his army into Gaul. From there he linked up with his old comrade, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the governor of Transalpine Gaul. Originally the Senate had sent Lepidus with an army to finish off Antony, but when many of his soldiers deserted to Antony's side, Lepidus engaged in negotiations instead. That following July, a victorious Octavian returned to Rome, but much to the Senate's horror, it was at the head of an army. Since two of Rome's reigning consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, had been killed in battle, Octavian forced the Senate to accept him as the new consul. And the very first motion he raised was to declare Brutus and Cassius as enemies of the Republic. This was the moment when Cicero knew that he had gravely underestimated him.
My father died on this floor. Right there. Butchered by men he called his friends. Who will tell me that is not murder? Who will tell my legions, who love Caesar as I do, that that is not murder? Who will speak against the motion?
Furious of being outmaneuvered, Cicero sent a letter to Brutus, stating that Octavian and Mark Antony were fighting amongst themselves, and now a defenseless Rome needed to be liberated again from tyrants. Overjoyed, Brutus and Cassius rallied their 17 legions to march on Rome.
Antony and Octavian hate each other far more than they hate us. Soon enough, they must fight each other for supremacy. We need only wait Mop up the survivors.
Outnumbered by the liberators, Octavian turned for help in the unlikeliest place by joining forces with his enemy, Mark Antony and Lepidus. This alliance would later be known as the Second Triumvirate. With it, their combined armies gave them the numbers they needed to face the liberators. However, before facing them in battle, HBO's Rome shows the Triumvirs enacting a horrific policy to consolidate their power.
Making use of strategic surprise is obvious. To that end, there is a list of the most prominent friends and supporters of Brutus and Cassius left in Rome. We should kill them.
These lists of names were known as the Prescriptions, first used by the Roman dictator Sulla in 82 BC. Their purpose was to liquidate their political opposition and confiscate all their lands and money. They were stripped of their rights and protection under the law, and any citizen who acted as an informer or murdered the names on that list would be rewarded. But aside from killing their enemies, the Prescriptions were really just about stealing money. After all, it included thousands of the wealthiest patricians in Rome. And the most famous name on that list was Cicero, as Antony had more reason than anyone in wanting him dead. So moving on from that, let's dive into the climactic showdown between the Triumvirs and the Liberators. In late September 42 BC, the Caesarian loyalists found the armies of Brutus and Cassius near Philippi in Greece. Now, unlike the Battle of Pharsalus in Season 1, we are finally treated to a real battle sequence. But unfortunately, what we see is a very condensed version of how it was fought. An important thing to mention is that the Battle of Philippi was actually two separate engagements. One took place on October 3rd and the other on October 23rd. The arid landscape we see in the sequence is also inaccurate, as the Romans fought in a varied terrain of dense woodland, flat plains, and swampy marshes. The Liberators had also built defensive fortifications and palisades, which made things difficult for the Caesarian army, but we don't see any of that in HBO's Rome. We also don't see how Brutus and Cassius actually died. In the show, a mortally wounded Cassius is brought before Brutus, and they exchange a few words before he dies. In reality, Cassius committed suicide on the very first day of battle. When his position was overrun by Antony's legions, he thought the same thing had happened to Brutus, not knowing that Brutus had actually overrun Octavian's camp and pushed back his forces. In the fog of war, he assumed the worst and took his life. Brutus, on the other hand, held on for nearly 3 weeks. On the 23rd of October, the Liberator army launched a massive assault against the Caesarians, but were ultimately defeated. In the aftermath, Brutus also committed suicide like Cassius. Now, we do see that in the show, but not in the manner it's presented, where Brutus takes off his armor, walks up to the oncoming soldiers alone, and attacks them. Now, I personally love this moment because it mirrors how Julius Caesar was murdered, stabbed dozens of times from all sides. Despite the fact that this is not how it happened, I believe these changes add to the drama. I mean, no doubt Brutus reflected on the decisions he had made leading up to his death, and this wonderfully written and performed scene visually communicates that to the audience. And so the deaths of Brutus and Cassius would effectively mark the downfall of the Roman Republic as they knew it. For nearly 500 years it proudly stood, but it was now in its death throes. By killing a tyrant, they had unknowingly created a martyr. Caesar was to be deified and remembered as the ultimate Roman. His name would live on through Octavian, making him Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And throughout the centuries, the name Caesar became a title for emperor. Through the Romans, the Byzantines, even going further, it would be emulated and adopted by the Holy Roman Emperors as Kaiser, and the Russian Emperors as the Tsars. Following their victory in Philippi, the Triumvirs returned to Rome. With all senatorial rule and influence snuffed out, they next decided how to officially legalize their power.
Clearly we three cannot all rule together at once. We shall only confuse and contradict each other.
True enough.
We must divide responsibilities.
What are you proposing?
I suggest we divide the territory of Rome into 3.
And just like that, this division of power was made. Octavian would rule Gaul, Hispania, and Italia. Lepidus would have Africa, but Antony got the real prize. From Egypt, he would rule the rich eastern provinces, made so by its high traffic of trade, commerce, and access to the Silk Road. As for Egypt, while not technically a Roman territory, it was a client kingdom. independent but heavily influenced by Rome. It also acted as the breadbasket of the ancient world by supplying the vital grain needed to feed Rome. Egypt also depended on Rome for its protection, and its recently crowned pharaoh Cleopatra was especially indebted. Before her sole ascension, she co-ruled Egypt with her younger brother and husband Ptolemy XIII, but envious of her popularity with the people, she was deposed from power and forced into hiding. But then, in 48 BC, a Roman general named Pompey Magnus arrived in Alexandria seeking refuge, having just been defeated in battle against Julius Caesar. Ptolemy, hoping to please Caesar, murdered Pompey and presented his head as a gift. Expecting gratitude, he was instead astonished with how appalled Caesar was. Despite being recent enemies, Pompey and Caesar were once old friends. Outraged, Caesar stormed out of the palace back to his compound. It was around this time that Cleopatra heard the news of Caesar's arrival in Alexandria and decided that the best way to reclaim her throne was with his help. Caesar's disgust with Ptolemy might give her the chance she desperately needed. Smuggled into Caesar's compound, she made one of the most memorable entrances in history. A rolled carpet was placed on the floor before Caesar, and it unrolled, revealing Cleopatra. This piqued his interest, and as they spoke, he became more and more attracted by her charm, intelligence, and sexuality. Cleopatra would successfully seduce Caesar and become his mistress. In return, he helped her win back her crown by defeating Ptolemy in the Battle of the Nile. 9 months after their first meeting, Cleopatra gave birth to a baby boy, whom they named Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Now, a quick thing to note about HBO's Rome is that when Caesar leaves Egypt, we never see Cleopatra visit or stay with him in Rome. In the show, she stays behind in Alexandria, but when she does come to Rome, it's at the worst possible moment. I mean, not only is it historically inaccurate, but also kind of stupid if you think about it. Because when HBO's Cleopatra comes to Rome, it's right after Caesar's assassination, which has never made sense to me. Especially if you consider how the real Cleopatra reacted. When Caesar was murdered, Cleopatra was in Rome at the time with Caesarion. Upon hearing the news, she fled the city. Without her lover's protection, she feared for her life and especially her babies. Many of Caesar's enemies already viewed her child as a threat, and being a son of Caesar was a dangerous thing to be. So she went back to Alexandria and waited, keeping her distance, and watched how things developed. You know, like a normal person. But in the show, she not only comes to Rome, presumably for the first time, but brings Caesarion with her to a city that's in the middle of a power struggle and is fraught with danger. Then she confronts Antony and asks him to publicly declare Caesarion as Caesar's legal son.
A simple, public declaration of paternity would suffice.
And what would I profit by that?
You would have my eternal gratitude.
Your son will eat shit and die before I make him legal.
Remember that at this point in the show, Antony's trying to assert himself as Caesar's successor. He's already at odds with Octavian, he's not going to deal with another son of Caesar. But just wait, she not only does that, but she brings Caesarion right to Octavian's villa, who is also advocating his claim as Caesar's adopted son and heir. Caesarion's presence alone is a direct challenge, and Octavian has more reason than Antony in wanting him dead. So, I find this very out of character for the real Cleopatra. The Cleopatra I know was calculating, politically savvy, and incredibly intelligent. Some sources stated that she was fluent in 9 different languages, which says a lot. But I never got that impression from HBO's Cleopatra. I mean, like 1 minute she's a junkie, and in the next she's a capable seductress who somehow puts herself in unnecessary, dangerous circumstances. I mean, I just find it inconsistent. It's also a shame they couldn't afford to shoot Antony and Cleopatra's first significant meeting the way it happened, which didn't take place in Rome, but in 41 BC in the city of Tarsus, after Antony had already taken control of the eastern provinces. At this point, he wasn't really concerned about being Caesar's successor. He ruled the richest provinces in the ancient world, and it was making him some serious bank. It was at this meeting that Cleopatra played her games with Antony, to seduce him in the same manner she had with Caesar. And how she goes about it is a lot more interesting than what we see in the show. At the docks of Tarsus, Cleopatra arrived in a royal galley. Antony sent an envoy, inviting her to have dinner with him ashore. but instead she makes a counter-offer, inviting him for dinner aboard her galley. This invitation was obviously a power play, but it nevertheless intrigued Antony. He decides to come aboard and see this Egyptian pharaoh for himself. He's quick to find this galley is lavished with gold, exotic silks and ornaments, everything to represent the extreme wealth of Egypt, but more importantly, the status and power of its queen, to impress Antony and make him see her not as a subservient ruler to Rome, but as an equal or possibly even greater. No doubt Antony had never met a woman like her before. There are many remarkable stories of Cleopatra's efforts to impress Mark Antony. The most famous was when she bet Antony that she could host the most expensive banquet in the world, quoting it would cost 10 million sesterces, which in today's money would amount to almost $30 million. When Antony accepted the bet, Cleopatra ushered in a slave to bring in a glass of vinegar. Plucking out her pearl earring, she drops it into the vinegar, and when it dissolved, she drank the entire glass and won the bet. So this is already a much better demonstration of her character than what we see in the show. Sadly, one of the most famous women in history just didn't leave much an impression on me. Instead of that famous galley meeting, we get Antony's stuffy office and an awkward dinner party. And they don't see each other again until Antony's arrival in Egypt at the end of episode 8. Speaking of which, this might be a good place to go over Rome's final episodes and how rushed everything feels. That massive time jump in episode 9 is a little jarring, but you kinda have to expect it at this point. I mean, there was no way in hell that they could afford showing Mark Antony's eastern campaigns against the Parthians, Armenians, and so forth. Instead, the show skips forward by about 10 years, to when a new conflict between Antony and Octavian was taking shape, made possible by Mark Antony and Cleopatra withholding Rome's grain shipments to provoke Octavian into declaring war. Now, it's true that Rome suffered from grain shortages, but this happened years before and had nothing to do with Mark Antony. They were because of naval blockades made by Sextus Pompey, the last surviving son of Pompey Magnus. He and his army had taken over Sicily and were using it as a base to commit acts of piracy, blockading Rome's access to grain from 39 BC to 36 BC. It apparently got so bad that there were reports of cannibalism. Now, if you're confused and can't remember any Sextus Pompey, that's because he's never mentioned in the show. The only son of Pompey we do see is Quintus Pompey, but in real life he never existed, and his character gets killed by Antony shortly after Caesar's assassination. So the show is clearly adapting these grain shortages to be used by Antony as a tactic against Octavian.
Well, if that doesn't make the little shit declare war, I don't know what will.
But the real reason for this prelude for war is a little bit more complex and had been building up for many years. By this point, Mark Antony and Octavian had grown accustomed to slagging each other off in public, each attacking the other's character and political authority. For example, Mark Antony accused Octavian of being a usurper, that the only reason he was posthumously adopted by Caesar was because he was the passive partner in their homosexual relationship. He also attacked Octavian's masculinity by pointing out that he never took part in any battle personally, and always relied on others to do his fighting for him, whether it be Mark Antony or Octavian's best friend Agrippa. On the other hand, Octavian played it a little bit smarter than that. He accused Antony of having no moral virtues, which is not exactly breaking news, since Antony was notorious for his excessive behavior, such as his drinking.
I'm afraid I drank rather too much. I could not get out of bed, no matter how hard I tried. I have the most shocking headache.
And his sexual deviancy.
I am not rising from this bed until I've fucked someone.
These well-known character traits would eventually come back to haunt Antony, especially after leaving his wife Octavia, who was Octavian's sister, and marrying Cleopatra. More accusations were made of Antony becoming Egyptianized, no longer resembling the proud Roman he once was. But what finally did it in the end was when Octavian claimed to have gotten his hands on Antony's will and testament. In it, he said that Antony was planning to divide Rome's eastern provinces to the children he sired with Cleopatra, that he officially recognized Cleopatra's son Caesarion as Caesar's legitimate successor, undermining Octavian's claim. And finally, upon his death, Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria and not Rome. It was this in particular that shocked and outraged the public. With this will, Octavian was able to convince the Roman people and Senate to declare war.
Having rejected his loving wife Octavia, Mark Antony has coupled himself to the sorceress Cleopatra, promising her dominion of all Rome.
Upon hearing the news of Octavian's warmongering, Antony and Cleopatra mobilized their navy. Their intention was to conquer Rome itself, but when their fleet got caught in a storm, Antony had it diverted for Greece to seek safe harbor. This gave Octavian the time he needed to respond. Eventually, his fleet and those of Antony and Cleopatra's would face each other for one final showdown on the 2nd of September 31 BC at the Battle of Actium. But unfortunately, in true HBO Rome fashion, we don't see this famous battle. We are instead caught up at its very end, with the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra. To quickly summarize what went wrong, one of Antony's generals had defected to Octavian, bringing him all of Antony's battle plans. With this advantage, Octavian's fleet wreaked havoc on Antony's, eventually trapping it, hurling fire and pitch at the Egyptian fleet, setting it ablaze. And when things were at their bleakest, Cleopatra decided to abandon the battle altogether. As Antony's fleet was engulfed in flames, it was the sight of his wife and queen fleeing that struck the heaviest blow. In that moment, he deserted his navy to their fate and took off after her. After losing everything, Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria. They barricaded themselves inside the royal palace and spent the next year waiting for the inevitable arrival of Octavian's army. When it finally did, the city of Alexandria was placed under siege, and Octavian sent a messenger demanding their surrender. Now, one cool thing I like to mention is an authentic moment when Antony sends back his reply.
I challenge your master to single combat.
Sir?
Let him meet me, face to face with sword and shield, just as our ancestors did. Then we shall see who is the better man.
So when I first saw this scene, I thought it was simply a creative way of showing Antony's desperation, but I was surprised to discover that he really did do this, in fact on multiple occasions, but he was of course always refused. So knowing their days were numbered, Cleopatra made a tragic attempt to save her life and the lives of her children. She did this by sending word to Antony that in her moment of despair and solitude, she committed suicide. With nothing left to live for, Antony decided to take his own life, but I should mention that there are no definitive accounts of his death. In the show, he dies right there and then, but Plutarch wrote that Antony survived the attempt. Although mortally wounded, he was brought before Cleopatra and died in her arms. With Octavian's permission, Cleopatra presided over her husband's funeral, but we don't see this in the show. Later, Cleopatra met face to face with her conqueror, and like she had done with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she attempted to win him over. But her charm and charisma would not succeed a third time, resorting to a desperate Cleopatra begging for her life. An amused Octavian took this pitiful display of an Egyptian queen as proof she wanted to live. He said he would spare her life if she accompanied him back to Rome. Cleopatra then knew that at the end of this trip awaited a humiliating death sentence. Like with Vercingetorix at the hands of Julius Caesar, she would be paraded through the streets in a triumph and executed before a jeering crowd. Playing for time, Cleopatra deceived Octavian by accepting his terms. She would later kill herself by placing a venomous asp on her breast. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemy dynasty, with the subjugation of Egypt under Roman rule. Denied Cleopatra as a prize, Octavian was forced to proceed with his triumph without her, resorting to an effigy in her likeness. With no enemies left to challenge him, Octavian would usher in a new era as Rome's sole ruler. It would be called Pax Romana, the Roman peace, an age of peace, prosperity and stability that would endure for over 200 years. Octavian would also change his name and become Caesar Divi Filius Augustus, the first Roman emperor. For this last chapter, I'm going to go over a few inaccuracies I left out earlier and give my final conclusion. As authentic as the show is, there are many discrepancies between what happens on screen to the historical events they're based on, especially in Season 2. One major inaccuracy that I'm sure that every history buff is dying for me to mention is the fate of Caesarion. The real Caesarion was 17 at the time, not 12 like shown here. He also didn't escape the clutches of Octavian and go into hiding with Titus Pullo. This is all complete fiction. Caesarion was actually caught soon after Cleopatra's death and murdered under Octavian's orders. For this next point, I honestly felt that this went without saying, but people are asking for me to mention it anyway. Basically how in HBO's Rome it's not true that Caesarion's the son of Titus Pullo, but was indeed Julius Caesar's. So if you're still wondering, Titus Pullo was not the father. Next, I'd like to talk about Servilia. Like I said before, she was not involved in Caesar's murder. The only role she had was hosting the conspirators in her villa after the assassination had taken place and advised them on how to proceed. She also never had a sexual relationship with Octavia or any brutal rivalry with Attia. These key plot points are all works of fiction. The same goes for her final scene where she curses Attia and seals it by taking her own life. The real Servilia lived comfortably for many years before dying of old age. Unlike Attia, who died much earlier in 43 BC, just before the Battle of Philippi, making her presence in Octavian's triumph impossible. She also never had an affair with Mark Antony and wasn't known for being promiscuous. The real Attia was considered a moral, pious woman, the complete opposite of her on-screen counterpart. They don't even share the same name. Attia of the Julii should really be Attia Balba. The show also dramatizes a lot of things with Octavia, mainly her relationships, such as her fling with Octavian's best friend Agrippa. There is nothing in written records to support this, but funnily enough, the real Agrippa did marry her daughter, Claudia Marcella. I should also point out that Octavia never had sex with her brother Octavian. This is also made up, and to be honest, it's kinda weird how HBO's produced 2 TV series featuring incest. The real Octavia was viewed by the public as the ideal Roman matron, especially when she adopted Antony and Cleopatra's surviving children. This act of kindness truly struck a chord with the Roman people. And as for my final thoughts on Rome, in spite of its many inaccuracies and creative liberties, I really do enjoy it. There is no doubt in my mind that its creators were passionate about this period and worked hard on bringing it to life, even whilst making it an entertaining show. I think that's why Rome has such a hardcore fan base. Its passion and history is evident on screen. And even though Rome does have problems, they all stem from the same place. In the end, it was simply too grand of a story to tell, and too expensive of a show to make. Bruno Heller, the creator of Rome, said this of its cancellation: "I discovered halfway through writing the second season the show was going to end. The second was going to end with the death of Brutus, the third and fourth season would be set in Egypt, fifth was going to be the rise of the Messiah in Palestine. But because we got the heads up that the second season would be it, I telescoped the third and fourth season into the second one, which accounts for the blazing speed we go through history near the end. There's certainly more than enough history to go around." So everything he just said sounded really awesome, so it's sad knowing that Rome's potential as an epic series will never be realized. And you can see evidence of where he was setting things up for the future, like that brief scene when Mark Antony meets the Jewish prince Herod in episode 7.
Help me take the throne of Judea. Make my enemies your enemies, and I offer you a substantial gift.
You must guarantee, of course, to keep your Jews in line.
They will do as I say, or they will suffer the consequences.
This future king of Judea is best remembered by an event in the Bible called the Massacre of the Innocents, an order Herod gave to execute all the male babies of Bethlehem. He did this out of fear for losing his throne, because of a prophecy that foretold the birth of a new king of the Jews. Well, that about wraps it up, but before I go, I would like to give a shout out to the channel Invicta History for helping me research this episode. From there, you could find out more about Roman units, tactics, battles, and campaigns over on their channel. And remember to tell them I said hi. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comment section what you thought about Rome. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.